If you had just one last wish before you died, what would you ask for? It wasn't the kind of question people expected to hear from a death row interview. But that's exactly how it started, an old reporter's scratchy voice crackling through the prison's PA system. The recording would soon go viral, but at that moment, it was just another Thursday morning in Huntsville, Texas. Hot. Quiet. Grim. The man sitting behind the bulletproof glass looked calm. Too calm, considering the circumstances. His name was Jack Raymond, inmate #4728C, scheduled for execution in 9 days. Convicted of first-degree murder at age 24, he'd spent over a decade in solitary confinement, counting down the hours that felt more like lifetimes. But when the reporter asked the question, Jack didn't even blink. He just smiled, small, tired, real, and answered. "I'd like to see my dog. Just once more. That's it." The silence that followed was deafening. The reporter chuckled awkwardly, waiting for the real answer. A steak dinner? A call with his mom? A visit from an old flame? But Jack's eyes didn't waver. "You mean like, a dog from the shelter or?" "No," Jack said, voice hoarse but steady. "My dog. Max." The room shifted. The air got heavier. Even the correctional officer standing nearby stiffened a little. This wasn't the answer they were ready for, and it certainly wasn't the kind that would stay locked behind prison walls. By the next day, the clip had found its way to TikTok, thanks to a prison volunteer named Sarah Gleason, who quietly recorded part of the interview on her phone. The caption read, "This man's last wish is to see the dog he lost 10 years ago. Should he get it?" In less than 48 hours, the video had 7.3 million views. Comments flooded in. "My heart broke in half. What kind of monster says no to a dying man's wish to see his dog? Wait, how did he even lose the dog? Hold on, why is he even on death row?" As it turns out, people cared. A lot. And the more they asked, the deeper they dug. Jack's story was simple on paper. Too simple. That's what made it feel off. He and a group of guys broke into a liquor store in Cincinnati. Things went south. A clerk was shot. No cameras, no fingerprints on the gun, but Jack didn't snitch on his friends. So he took the fall. Life or death. He got death. He didn't fight it. Never appealed. Never begged for anything, until Max. Meanwhile, inside Unit G of Huntsville Prison, Jack didn't even know what was happening outside. He'd been in the system long enough to recognize a hopeless cause when he saw one. He knew how requests worked. You got a Bible, a meal, maybe a cigarette. Not a dog. But Sarah knew. She'd been volunteering in the prison library for 5 years, and she'd seen the rare look of humanity in Jack's eyes when he mentioned Max. So she did what Jack couldn't, she reached out. She found Max's adoption records from 2014. The dog, an old German Shepherd Lab mix, had been taken to a rescue in Fort Worth after Jack's arrest. Sarah called. Left messages. Even drove up on her day off. Finally, a woman named Linda answered. "Yes," she said. "We still have Max." The dog was 14 now. Muzzled gray and nearly deaf, but still loyal. Still alive. When Sarah told Jack, he stared at the wall for a long time. "He's still here," he whispered. "He's still here," she said. Jack didn't cry. But something in him cracked open like a window. A sliver of light peeked through the darkness he'd built around himself for so long. That night, Sarah made a call she knew could cost her job. She contacted a local journalist, who'd been sniffing around prison reform stories for months. The headline the next day hit like a meteor across the internet. "Death row inmate's final wish, one last hug with his dog." It was only a matter of hours before the noise got too loud to ignore. Talk shows covered it. Hashtags trended. Hashtag let him see Max. Hashtag one last hug. Hashtag justice and mercy. A Change.org petition launched and gained over 1.2 million signatures in 24 hours. News stations replayed the interview. Experts debated it on live panels. But not everyone supported Jack. Some shouted, "He's a killer. Who cares about his feelings? Letting him see a dog doesn't change what he did. This is emotional manipulation." The divide grew deeper, louder, angrier. But Sarah held her ground. "You don't have to forgive him. Just let him say goodbye." Within the prison walls, Jack finally received word that the governor's office was reviewing the request. Not for clemency, just for compassion. He hadn't hoped for anything in over a decade. But that night, he asked for something he hadn't since he was a teenager. "Could I have a photo of Max?" Sarah slipped one through the folder she delivered the next morning. It was grainy, printed in black and white. But Jack stared at it like it was the Mona Lisa. He held it to his chest and whispered, "Good boy." In 9 days, he was supposed to die. But the world was watching now. Something strange was happening. Something rare. People weren't just reading headlines, they were feeling them. And no matter what they thought Jack deserved, they couldn't stop wondering. What kind of story ends with a man dying before he gets to hug his dog goodbye? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? It started with a dog. Just a man and a dog. But by the end of the weekend, it had become something much bigger, something that pierced deeper than crime statistics, beyond death row debates or broken justice systems. It became a mirror. And people didn't like what they saw. The headline had already made its rounds: "Death row inmate's final wish, one last hug with his dog." But what made it viral wasn't just the story. It was the photo. Black and white. Low res. Crooked frame. But Max's face said it all. Those cloudy eyes, barely open. The drooping ears. That quiet, weathered dignity only old dogs carry. And behind the photo, Jack's trembling hand holding it like it was glass. You could see the years between them. You could feel them. On Twitter, it was like someone hit a pressure valve. "We can't let this man die without seeing his dog. We just can't. I don't care what he did. This is human. This is real. No one should die without love." But for every 100 hearts breaking, there was a cold rebuttal. Victims don't get second chances. Why should he? This is emotional bait. Justice doesn't pet dogs. Let's not forget someone died. And they weren't wrong. A man had died. A liquor store clerk named Benjamin Reed, age 38, shot in the chest during a robbery that never should have happened. He had a wife. A daughter. A funeral no one went viral over. So when a local talk show brought the story to the airwaves, it didn't come without fire. Host 1, "It's a touching story, but at the end of the day, Jack Raymond is a convicted murderer." Host 2, "Sure, but we're not talking about overturning his sentence. Just letting him see his dog." Host 1, "Would you say the same if it was your father that got killed?" Host 2, "Maybe. Maybe not. But that's the point, right? Justice isn't supposed to be about revenge." Caller, Anonymous, "My brother's in prison too. Not on death row, but it's the same thing. They stop being people in there. If he wants to see his dog, let him." The wave didn't stop with talk shows. It hit Reddit. It hit Facebook. It hit Good Morning America. Then came the influencers. Animal advocates. Celebrities. At official Tessa Thorne, 3.2 million followers. Justice and mercy can exist in the same room. Let Jack hug his dog. At Justice for Animals now. If a man is about to die and the only soul he wants is his dog, maybe we should ask what kind of system breaks a man like that. In less than 72 hours, the petition crossed 3 million signatures. People didn't even care about the details anymore. The guilt, the case, the appeal Jack never filed. They saw a man who asked for love at the end. And that meant something. But inside the governor's office, it was chaos. Governor Ellis Monroe wasn't new to controversy. But nothing like this had landed on his desk before. "You're telling me a TikTok dog story is pulling in more attention than our education budget," he snapped during a staff meeting. The staffer, mid-20s, laptop covered in stickers, nodded. "Sir, the hashtag #LetHimSeeMax tag has more engagement than our entire campaign this month. It's a dog. It's not just a dog anymore." The governor ran a hand through his silver hair. "What about the victim's family?" Silence. "Have we heard from them?" As it turned out, Angela Reed, the widow of the murdered store clerk, hadn't made any public statements in years. Reporters reached out. No answer. Doorbell cameras. No comment. Silence. Until she posted something simple on Facebook. "I have nothing left to say about the man who took Ben from us. But if he wants to see a dog before he dies, that's between him and God." The post had 48,000 shares by midnight. Back inside Huntsville, Jack didn't have a phone. No social media. No idea what the world outside was doing in his name. All he had was a photo of Max, a Bible, and a thread of hope too thin to pull on. But Sarah knew. She visited the next morning, her face flushed with adrenaline and disbelief. "You're everywhere," she said. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "TikTok. Twitter. You're famous." "For what?" "For being a man who wants to see his dog." Jack looked down at his hands. "That's all I ever was." Later that night, as he lay on his bunk, Jack thought about Max. He pictured the way Max used to jump onto the couch without asking. The way he tilted his head at strange sounds. The time he'd eaten an entire cheeseburger from Jack's plate and then licked his face like it was an apology. He thought about how, after all the violence, after all the noise of the world, Max was the only creature who had ever looked at him like he mattered. No judgment. No questions. Just love. That was the part the news hadn't gotten wrong. On the outside, protesters had started showing up at the gates of the prison. Some held signs that said, "Let him hug Max." Others screamed, "Justice for Ben," through bullhorns. Cops stood between them. The air was tense. Two Americas, split down the middle, shouting into the dark. But the decision wasn't in their hands anymore. It rested with the governor, a team of lawyers, and a bureaucratic system moving just fast enough to be too slow. Then, on a Sunday morning, just 6 days before Jack's scheduled execution, an official letter arrived at the prison. Stamped. Signed. Approved. The request was granted. Jack Raymond would be allowed a 30-minute supervised visit with Max the day before his execution. He read the letter 3 times. Then a 4th. His hands were shaking. "He's really coming?" Jack asked Sarah. "He's really coming," she said. Jack nodded slowly, eyes glassy but firm. "Then I'm ready." Jack Raymond was born on a Tuesday. The sky was gray, and the nurse who delivered him whispered to another, "Poor kid, starting life already behind." They weren't wrong. He came into the world in a trailer parked on the edge of Dayton, Ohio, 1 bedroom, 1 leaky roof, one mother already 2 years into an addiction she swore she'd quit when he was born. His father? Gone before Jack turned 3. No birthday card. No phone call. Just an empty chair in every school play and a scar Jack didn't realize he had until much later. By the time he was 7, Jack had learned how to make himself invisible. At school, he was the quiet kid with old shoes and a backpack that smelled like smoke. At home, he ducked when the yelling started, slept in the bathtub when it didn't stop, and stole crackers from the pantry when the fridge went empty. There were no bedtime stories. No homework help. No one cheering at soccer games. Just noise. Cold. And survival. When he was 10, he found his mom unconscious on the kitchen floor with a needle still in her arm. She lived. Barely. But the system stepped in, finally. Jack was pulled from the trailer and shuffled between foster homes like a suitcase no one wanted to carry. He'd stay a few months, sometimes a year, then get the call. He's too quiet. He doesn't connect. He has anger issues. But how do you explain that the world taught you early on not to trust warmth? That every time someone smiled, it came with a catch. That you learned to survive by not needing anyone? It wasn't until age 14 that something changed. His latest foster home was with a man named Henry, a retired army vet who didn't say much but had a house that smelled like coffee and oak. The first night there, Henry handed Jack a towel, showed him where the laundry went, then said, "You do your part, I'll do mine." It was more than anyone had ever offered. But the real shift came 2 weeks later, when Henry took Jack to the county shelter. "You ever had a dog?" he asked. Jack shook his head. "Well, time you had one." That's where Jack met Max. He was just a pup back then, lanky legs, floppy ears, black fur that hadn't grown into its shape yet. Every other dog barked or whined. Max just looked at Jack, head tilted, tail still, like he already knew something no one else did. Their eyes locked. Jack felt it in his chest. "He yours if you want him," Henry said. Jack knelt beside the cage, whispering, "Hi, buddy," as Max pressed his nose against the bars. It was the first time Jack had ever felt chosen. From that day forward, they were inseparable. Max slept at the foot of Jack's bed, followed him to the bus stop, sat next to him during late-night study sessions. They shared everything: peanut butter, old flannel blankets, the silence between storms. For the first time, Jack laughed. He smiled. He opened up. Because Max didn't care about Jack's past. He didn't ask questions. He didn't flinch when Jack had night terrors or went quiet for hours. Max just stayed. And for a kid who had always been left behind, that meant everything. But peace doesn't last forever, not in Jack's world. When Jack was 17, Henry had a stroke while mowing the backyard. Jack found him slumped over the mower, mouth drooping, breath shallow. He called 911. He rode in the ambulance. He waited at the hospital. But Henry never came home. The state came again, like it always did. Said Jack was still a minor. Said he couldn't live alone. Said Max would have to go to a shelter unless someone claimed him. Jack begged. Pleaded. Promised he'd finish school, get a job, stay out of trouble. They didn't listen. Max was taken away. Jack was moved to a group home across town, a windowless building with cold meals and colder rules. Something in him broke that day. By 18, Jack was on his own. No diploma. No money. No Max. He crashed on couches, did odd jobs, stayed quiet. But grief has a way of hardening you. And when you're young, poor, and alone, it doesn't take much to slide into survival mode. So when a guy from the neighborhood, Trey, someone older and slick, offered him cash to ride along on a quick job, Jack said yes. He didn't ask questions. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't expect anyone to die. But someone did. The night of the robbery was a blur. Jack was outside, watching the alley. Trey and 2 others went in. Screams. A gunshot. Running feet. Sirens. Flashing lights. Jack was arrested first. When detectives asked what happened, he stayed silent. Maybe out of loyalty. Maybe out of fear. Maybe because, deep down, he still believed silence kept him safe. But this time, it didn't. Without a deal. Without a lawyer who cared. Jack went down for first-degree murder. He was 24. And Max? Jack never found out where he ended up. He tried writing letters from county jail, but no one responded. It was like the world had taken the only soul that ever loved him and locked it away, just like him. That's why, all these years later, when they asked him what his last wish was, it wasn't a cheeseburger. Or a phone call. Or forgiveness. It was Max. Because when you've lived your whole life abandoned by people, the one who stayed, who never judged, who never left, that's who matters most at the end. He's not just a dog, Jack once told Sarah. He's the only part of me that wasn't broken. They say dogs can smell fear. That they sense it before we speak it, hear it in the way we breathe, feel it in the way our hearts race. But Max had a sixth sense for something deeper. Pain. Not just the kind that bleeds, but the kind that stays invisible. The kind you carry in your chest, quiet and constant, like a storm cloud that never bursts. And Jack carried a lifetime's worth. Back when Max first came home, Jack was still learning what safety felt like. He didn't trust couches. Or doors left unlocked. Or people who smiled without asking for something in return. But Max changed that, slowly. He'd curl up beside Jack at night, a warm body pressed against a kid who had never been held. He'd wait by the bathroom door when Jack showered, then wag his tail like it was a celebration when Jack stepped out. Jack started talking more, not to people, but to Max. About the food at school. About a classmate who pushed him in the hallway. About how he didn't want to feel so angry all the time. Max would just sit there, ears perked, tongue lolling, as if to say, I get it. Keep going. Henry, Jack's foster dad, noticed the change too. You're different now, he said one morning, pouring Jack a mug of coffee he wasn't technically old enough to drink. Different how? Quieter. But lighter. Jack shrugged. I think the dog fixed something in you, Henry said with a half-smile. Jack didn't respond. But he looked down at Max, curled at his feet. He didn't say it out loud, but he thought. No. He didn't fix me. He just made me believe I wasn't broken. The years that followed were still hard. Jack had to fight off the ghosts of the past, nights where his mom screamed until dawn, afternoons where hunger clawed his stomach, mornings where he wondered if he mattered to anyone. But Max was always there. A silent witness. A steadfast presence. When Henry died and Max was taken away, Jack felt like a part of himself had been amputated. And when prison bars closed around him, it wasn't the freedom he missed most. It wasn't even the sunlight or the open air. It was that sound, the soft pad of paws on the kitchen floor. It was the rhythm of Max's breathing at night. It was the feeling of being loved without having to prove anything. In Huntsville, Jack served time like he served grief, quietly. He didn't cause problems. He didn't make friends. He didn't talk much to the guards, the chaplain, or the volunteers. He didn't even speak during therapy sessions. Until Sarah showed him that photo. The one where Max, graying, older, but still Max, sat in the yard of the rescue center, ears perked as if waiting for someone who might never come. Jack looked at that photo for hours. Do you want to talk about him? Sarah asked gently. Jack nodded. And for the first time in years, he did. He told her about the first night Max refused to sleep on the floor, choosing instead to curl up next to Jack's feet like a furry guardian angel. He told her about how Max would sit at the window for hours whenever Jack was gone, waiting. He told her about the bad days, how Max would rest his head on Jack's knee, eyes soft, like he knew exactly what Jack needed. He even told her about the night he found out Henry died. Max laid next to me on the porch. All night. He didn't sleep. He didn't bark. Just stayed. Sarah's eyes welled up. That's love, Jack, she whispered. Jack nodded slowly. It was more than love. It was like, he saw the parts of me nobody else wanted to see. And he stayed anyway. As the countdown to his execution ticked closer, Jack found himself remembering things in vivid detail, things he'd buried under years of concrete, steel, and silence. The sound of Max drinking water too fast from his bowl and then hiccuping. The way he'd bark at lawnmowers but hide from kittens. How he'd whine at the door 5 minutes before Jack even got home, like he knew his boy was near. Jack wasn't afraid of dying. Not really. He was afraid of dying before Max knew he hadn't been forgotten. That, after all the years apart, Max would think Jack had moved on. He won't remember me, Jack said one night. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You really think that? Jack stared at the floor. It's been 10 years. Dogs don't forget love. Ever. On day 4 before the execution, Sarah brought him something else. A short video, less than 30 seconds. Max, now slow and stiff, sitting in a grassy field as someone off camera said. Hey Max, guess who's coming? Max's ears twitched. His head turned. His tail thumped once. Twice. Jack watched the clip 4 times. The 5th time, he cried. Not loud. Not broken. Just tears he'd held for too long, finally sliding free. He remembers me, he whispered. Of course he does, Sarah said, placing her hand on the glass. That night, in his tiny cell, Jack closed his eyes and imagined the moment. Max, walking slowly across the prison yard. Jack, chained at the ankles, waiting. No crowds. No noise. Just them. Just like it used to be. Only this time, there was no future, only that one moment to say goodbye. And Jack promised himself one thing. He'd hold Max so tight the past wouldn't matter anymore. Because for that one moment, nothing else would. By the 5th day before the execution, the gates of Huntsville unit weren't just guarded by officers anymore. They were guarded by voices. Loud ones. Passionate ones. Divided ones. On one side, signs that read. Let him see his dog. Compassion isn't a crime. One last moment, that's all he asked. On the other, banners scrawled with heavier words. Remember Benjamin Reed. A dog for a murderer. No justice in that. Mercy for monsters. Never. The crowd had doubled in size since the governor's approval was leaked. What started as a quiet campaign of online voices had now become a physical wall of emotion, surging at the prison's gates like a tide with no interest in receding. News vans lined the streets. Satellite dishes sprouted like weeds. Reporters wore bulletproof vests, not because they feared danger, but because the moment had become history in real time. This isn't about just one man and one dog anymore, a CNN reporter said during a live segment. It's about what kind of society we are at the end of someone's life. By that afternoon, #LetHimSeeMax was trending #1 worldwide. Inside the prison, Jack could hear faint echoes of shouting through the concrete. He sat on the edge of his cot, flipping the dog-eared photo of Max between his fingers. It was getting soft at the corners now, worn from the way he held it every night, like a lifeline made of paper. Sarah visited that morning with an update. It's gotten big out there. I figured, Jack said, rubbing his wrist absent-mindedly. It's louder than usual. Louder and angrier. She slid a small legal pad under the glass, folded in half. Jack opened it. A letter. From Benjamin Reed's daughter, Kayla. He blinked twice before reading. Dear Mr. Raymond. I don't remember much about my dad. I was only 7 when he died. What I do remember is how people talked about him: kind, hardworking, good at telling stories. I won't pretend to understand what you were thinking that night, or what kind of pain you've carried. But I've read about your request. I've seen the video. And even though I'll never get to say goodbye to my dad, I hope you get to say goodbye to your dog. Asterisk. Kayla Reed. Jack didn't know how long he stared at the paper. She didn't have to write that, he finally said. No, Sarah agreed. But she did. What kind of person forgives someone like me? Maybe someone who knows what it feels like to lose love too early. Jack exhaled slowly, voice barely above a whisper. I wish the world had more people like her. That same afternoon, the governor held a press conference. He looked tired. Polished, but pale. Like a man who hadn't slept in days and knew every word he said could end his career, or define it. The decision to allow Jack Raymond a final visit with his dog was not made lightly, Governor Monroe began. We understand and respect the pain of the Reed family. Their loss is immeasurable. But this is not an act of forgiveness. It is an act of humanity. This is not clemency. Jack Raymond's sentence remains in place. The execution will proceed as scheduled. But one final request, to hold a creature that brought him peace in the darkest time, will be honored. Because mercy, even in small doses, is not weakness. It is who we are. The words hit like a drumline across every major network. Some clapped. Some jeered. Others wept. But it was real now. Jack would see Max. That night, the protest swelled to nearly 400 people. Police began redirecting traffic. Volunteers passed out water bottles. One man fainted from heat exhaustion and was treated on the lawn of a nearby church. And still, they came. Mothers holding babies. Veterans in uniform. Dog lovers with golden retrievers on leashes. Former inmates. College students. Pastors. Protesters. Survivors. Victims' rights groups. America had shown up, for a dog, yes, but also for something more complicated. Something aching. Something unresolved. Meanwhile, in a small corner of the Fort Worth Animal Sanctuary, Max lay curled on a padded mat inside a travel kennel. He was older now. Stiffer. But when someone opened the door and whispered, "Jack's waiting," his ears still twitched. Linda, the rescue coordinator, ran her hand gently down Max's spine. "Tomorrow, boy," she whispered. "You'll see him tomorrow." Max looked up at her, eyes cloudy but knowing. He didn't bark. But his tail thumped. Once. Back in his cell, Jack couldn't sleep. The shouting outside had dulled to a hum, but inside, his mind roared. What would Max remember? Would he recognize him? Would he be afraid? Jack hadn't held anything in over a decade. Not a hand. Not a hug. Not a heartbeat. How do you prepare to hold the only soul you ever loved, one last time? He ran a hand over his buzzed head. Rubbed his temples. He'd been numb for so long. But now the feelings came back all at once, like rain after drought. Fear. Hope. Gratitude. Grief. It didn't matter what came next. Tomorrow, he would hold Max. And for Jack Raymond, that meant everything. There's something surreal about knowing the exact date and time you're going to die. For most people, death arrives like a thief, uninvited, sudden, and merciless. But for Jack Raymond, death had a schedule. A file. A countdown. A state seal stamped in red. Tomorrow at 6 p.m., the sentence would be carried out. But before that, he would get 30 minutes with Max. The morning sun crept across the cement floor of Jack's cell. He hadn't slept, not really. He'd closed his eyes, sure. Drifted off here and there. But the hours felt elastic, stretching, folding in on themselves. He spent most of the night pacing. Thinking. Praying, maybe. He didn't ask for freedom. Didn't ask for a miracle. Just that Max would remember him. And that somehow, holding him one last time would be enough to make peace with all the pain he couldn't undo. At 7:15 a.m., the chaplain came by. Reverend Thomas, a tall, soft-spoken man who had been walking death row for over a decade. He didn't preach to Jack. He never had. Just offered presence. And silence. This morning, though, he brought a small envelope. This came in for you. Jack opened it slowly. Inside was a card, hand-painted, with a picture of a dog under a tree. On the back was a short note. No soul should leave this world unloved. Thank you for loving him. A fellow dog person. Jack smiled. People are kinder than I expected, he said quietly. Reverend Thomas nodded. We surprise each other in the best ways. Even at the end. At 9 a.m., Jack was moved to a holding cell closer to the visitation yard where the meeting would take place. The space was sterile, but not cruel. It had a single chair, a table, and, oddly enough, a faint smell of fresh grass. The prison yard was just a few feet beyond a chain-link fence, and somewhere nearby, someone was mowing. Jack sat and waited, the silence heavy. Sarah arrived at 9:45. He's on his way, she said gently, sitting across from him. Is he okay with car rides? Jack asked. Slept the whole time. Snored like an old man. Jack chuckled softly. That tracks. You sure you're ready? Jack paused. I don't think anyone's ready for their last goodbye. But yeah. I want this. At 10:17 a.m., the kennel van pulled into the back lot. Two handlers, both dressed in clean navy polos, stepped out and opened the rear hatch. Max didn't rush. He didn't bark or whine. He stood slowly, sniffed the air, and stepped out onto the pavement like a king returning home. When Jack saw him from the window, his knees went weak. Max was older now. His muzzle had gone white. His hips ached as he walked. But it was him. It was Max. Jack pressed a trembling hand to the glass, eyes wide. He's here, he whispered. Sarah nodded. You're going out in 5 minutes. Those next few moments were the longest of Jack's life. He was escorted through a side door, no cuffs, no chains, just two quiet guards who understood this wasn't a prisoner transfer. It was a reunion. The yard had been cleared. A chair waited near the far wall. Beside it, Max, sitting calmly, tail thumping once every few seconds. When Jack stepped through the gate, he froze. Max didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He just tilted his head, eyes glassy, staring. Then, he stood. One step. Another. Then suddenly, a jog. The old dog ran, with everything his bones could offer. Jack dropped to his knees. Hey, buddy, he choked out. It's me. Max barreled into him, head buried in Jack's chest, tail thumping against the concrete like a heartbeat. And Jack, stoic, broken, rebuilt Jack, collapsed into sobs. The guards turned away. Sarah wiped her eyes. Even the warden, standing at a respectful distance, lowered his head. No one said a word. Because this wasn't just a visit. It was redemption in its purest form. Jack and Max stayed locked together, Jack's arms wrapped around the dog like a lifeline. I missed you so much, Jack whispered into Max's fur. They took you away and I couldn't find you, but I never stopped thinking about you. Not once. You saved me, Max. When nobody else would. You loved me when I didn't know how to love myself. Max licked his face, once. Then twice. He didn't move far from Jack's lap for the next half hour. They sat in silence. Jack scratched behind Max's ears, ran his fingers over the ribs that now poked beneath aging skin. You waited for me, he said quietly. Max rested his head on Jack's thigh and let out a deep, steady sigh, the kind that only comes from finding home again. When the handler gave the 5-minute warning, Jack nodded. He didn't beg for more time. He didn't make a scene. He kissed Max on the forehead. Thank you, he whispered. You were the best part of my life. Max looked up at him, eyes steady. And in that moment, Jack didn't see a dog. He saw forgiveness. As they led Max away, Jack stood still, hands at his sides, shoulders square. He didn't look back, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew what Max needed to remember. That his boy was strong. That his boy was okay. That his boy loved him until the very last second. When Jack returned to his holding cell, he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. Sarah came in quietly. You did good, she said. No, Jack replied. He did good. Outside, the protest continued. But the noise was different now. Softer. Quieter. More reverent. Because for the first time in the whole firestorm of opinions, arguments, hashtags, and headlines, everyone agreed on one thing. That was love. And no one deserved to die without it. The minutes between 12:01 p.m. and 6 p.m. stretched like an eternity wrapped in steel and silence. Jack sat alone in his holding cell, a Bible open on the metal table, not because he believed he was going anywhere, but because the weight of it steadied his hands. Inside the front cover, the chaplain had written one verse in thick black ink. Mercy triumphs over judgment. James 2 verse 13. Jack didn't know if it was true. But today, he wanted it to be. The prison moved with clinical precision. At 2 p.m., they brought him his final meal, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and a Dr. Pepper. Jack didn't ask for much. He wasn't hungry. But he took a few bites out of respect for the people who prepared it. And for Max. You always liked the way I snuck you chicken, he whispered to himself, setting a drumstick aside like an offering. Too greasy, but you didn't care. The guards didn't speak unless necessary. Not out of coldness, but because this kind of day didn't need extra words. They respected him now. Jack could feel it in the silence. At 3:15 p.m., Sarah returned. She was allowed one final visit. No glass. No phones. Just a room with 2 chairs, 2 people, and an ocean of things left unsaid. Jack was the first to speak. He knew me. Sarah smiled. Of course he did. When I touched him, it was like all those years disappeared. We were just us again. Me and Max. On Henry's porch. Waiting for the sun to set. She nodded. It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Do you think I deserve this? He asked suddenly. Sarah didn't hesitate. I think no one deserves what happened to Benjamin Reed. I also think you've carried that with you every day since. And I think loving something deeply, without expecting anything back, is the most human thing any of us can do. Jack stared at her for a long time. Thank you, he said softly. For what? For seeing me. Not the papers. Not the crime. Me. 4 p.m. The light outside shifted from gold to ash. The shadows got longer. Inside, Jack was given clean clothes. A pressed white shirt. Loose-fitting pants. No shoes. He looked at himself in the mirror and hardly recognized the man staring back. No longer the kid from the trailer. No longer the angry teenager with fists always clenched. This man looked tired, but at peace. 4:45 p.m. Reverend Thomas returned. He stood next to Jack as he sat on the edge of the bed. "You still want me in the room?" the Reverend asked. "Yes," Jack said. "Not to pray for me, but for Max. He gave me the only pure thing I ever had. I want someone to carry that with them." The Reverend placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "I will." Outside, the crowd swelled. Over 1,000 people now stood vigil. Some sang. Some lit candles. Some held signs that read, "Love redeems." He held his dog, "Now let him go in peace. Mercy is strength." Others remained stone-faced, arms crossed, still believing that death was justice, no matter how gentle the man had become. At 5:15 p.m., Jack was escorted down the hallway. It wasn't a long walk, but every step echoed like a lifetime. He passed the chapel, the mess hall, the rec yard. Each place held 1,000 memories. Conversations. Silences. And then, he reached the chamber. The room was small. Cold. Lit by buzzing fluorescent lights that cast everything in a harsh gray. A gurney waited in the center. Jack looked at it and exhaled. "Okay," he whispered. He climbed on without being asked. The straps were fastened carefully. Not tight. Not rushed. Just, respectfully. Sarah stood behind the glass. So did Reverend Thomas. Jack scanned the room once, eyes calm. "I'm ready," he said. But before the injection began, the warden leaned down. "We were gonna let you say something, Jack." Jack nodded. He looked into the glass where cameras and eyes and histories watched him. Then he looked toward the ceiling. "I don't know how to ask for forgiveness. I don't know if I deserve it. But I know what love feels like. And I got that. From Max. Every day. Without question. I hope, wherever I'm going, he's waiting." A pause. "Tell him I'll bring the chicken this time." At 5:58 p.m., the drugs began to flow. At 5:59, Jack Raymond closed his eyes. And at 6:01, with the faintest smile still resting on his face, his heart stopped. In the crowd outside, word traveled quickly. People held each other. Some cried. Some stood in silence. But no one cheered. Because something about what had just happened felt sacred. Back at the sanctuary, Max slept peacefully in his kennel. His tail twitched in his sleep. As if he knew, somehow, that Jack had kept his promise. And that love, real love, had walked him home. By 6:15 p.m., May 17th, the headlines were already flooding in. "Executed man's final wish moves millions," the New York Times. "Jack Raymond and Max, a love story to the end," CNN. "Redemption, or just optics?" Nation divided after unprecedented death row visit, Fox News. "Dog's loyalty outlives the man, a final goodbye that shook the internet," BuzzFeed. And trending at number 2 worldwide on social media, right beneath a celebrity cheating scandal. Hashtag he held his dog. In the hours after his death, America didn't know what to do with its feelings. For some, Jack's final act. The quiet dignity, the tears, the tenderness, complicated their view of the death penalty. Others doubled down. "He still took a life," one man posted on X. "A dog doesn't erase that." "He didn't ask for forgiveness," a woman replied. "He lived it." At the Fort Worth Animal Sanctuary, Max sat on his bed, licking peanut butter from a chew toy. He moved slower now. Ate less. But still responded to voices, especially the ones who used Jack's tone, soft, low, calm. Linda, the coordinator, had never seen anything like the outpouring that followed. They'd received over 20,000 emails in one night. Donations flooded in. Handwritten letters from children. Poems from veterans. Portraits of Max drawn in colored pencil. Someone even shipped a homemade quilt stitched with the words, "You waited. He came." Sarah didn't sleep that night. She stayed at the prison until every candle outside the gates had been extinguished. Then she drove home in silence, the weight of the day pressing against her ribs like grief in disguise. When she opened her front door, she found an envelope on the floor. Slipped through the mail slot. No return address. Inside was a simple note. "You didn't save a killer. You saved a human." Meanwhile, Reverend Thomas sat alone in his chapel. He had watched over 20 executions in his career. But none had felt like this. There was something sacred in that goodbye, he told the local paper the next day. He didn't ask for pity. He asked for presence. For one moment of truth before everything ended. And the world watched it happen. In New York, Kayla Reed, the daughter of the man Jack killed, turned off her television and sat in silence. Her friends had called all night. "Are you okay? Did you watch? Do you regret writing that letter?" She didn't regret it. What she regretted was not knowing her father long enough to understand what he would have thought. But something inside her, some quiet, stubborn gut instinct, told her he would have wanted this ending. Not because it erased the crime, but because it refused to ignore the humanity. The next morning, Jack Raymond's name appeared in over 180 opinion pieces across the country. Some said his final act had softened the edges of capital punishment. Others called it a manipulation, a calculated PR moment designed to sway public emotion. One op-ed read, "He killed a man. Then cried holding a dog. We're a nation so starved for tenderness, we mistook that for sainthood." But another responded, "Redemption doesn't erase wrongdoing. It adds meaning to what comes after." And Jack Raymond used his last breath to show what love looks like. The warden, not known for public comments, issued a rare statement. "We've carried out dozens of sentences at Huntsville. This one was different." The decision to grant a final visit with Mr. Raymond's dog was met with scrutiny. But in that yard, we witnessed no manipulation. No theatrics. Just a man saying goodbye to the only soul who never gave up on him. I've never seen the execution chamber feel quieter. Across the country, debates began. Talk shows. Podcasts. Church sermons. College campuses. Should compassion play a role in justice? Can a final act of love outweigh a lifetime of mistakes? Do dogs see the person, or the potential? But far from the debates, far from the noise, one story quietly made its rounds. In a rural Texas town, a sixth-grade English teacher gave her students a new assignment. Write about something, or someone, you would want by your side in your final hour. Most wrote about parents. Some wrote about God. But one boy, thin and shy, turned in a drawing of a dog with gray fur and wise eyes. He wrote just 3 words beneath it. Like Jack did. By 9 a.m. the day after Jack's execution, the video had gone viral. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a private moment between Jack and Max, filmed by one of the prison's guards, likely to be archived for internal records, or to be used for their own purposes. But somehow, in the digital age, things didn't stay private long. A blurry, grainy video appeared on TikTok, titled, "Jack Raymond's Last Goodbye to Max," the full video. Within hours, it had been shared over 5 million times. The video wasn't much, just a few seconds. But in those few seconds, the entire narrative of Jack's execution shifted. What viewers saw wasn't just the act of a man saying goodbye to his dog. It was raw. It was painful. It was pure humanity, stripped down to the simplest form of love. The kind that could make even the hardest hearts waver. The video started with a close-up of Jack's face, eyes filled with the weight of a man who knew what was coming. But as the camera pulled back, the moment Jack held out his arms to Max, it became clear. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't for show. Max's tail wagged with eager joy. Jack gently placed his hands on the dog's head, a soft but deliberate gesture, a moment of quiet intimacy between them. Then, in a rare and intimate moment of vulnerability, Jack whispered something into Max's ear. The camera zoomed in on his lips, and though the words were faint, people could make out. "I'm sorry, buddy. I'll see you on the other side." By the time the video made its way to YouTube, it was clear that the world had seen something different from the news coverage. What had been presented as an execution, a grim and final chapter in a story of crime and punishment, was now a moment of redemption. The reactions were swift. "This is humanity. I can't stop crying. Is this what forgiveness looks like?" But it didn't stop there. As the video spread, social media exploded. People shared their personal reactions, many of which were deeply emotional. A professor in California shared her thoughts on Twitter. "Jack Raymond was a killer. But what is a life when it's lived without love? This video changes everything. I'm not sure what justice is anymore." The hashtag he held his dog continued to trend, with more people adding their voices. A therapist wrote, "We're all looking for connection, for some way to heal. I think Jack found that in Max. And now we need to ask ourselves, what happens when we, as a society, show mercy?" Even those who had supported Jack's execution couldn't deny the emotional weight of the moment. On Reddit, a thread titled, "Can Love Ever Be Enough to Forgive a Crime?" had over 25,000 responses. Some users expressed that Jack's love for Max didn't erase his crime, but others argued that the video showed Jack's growth, his humanity in his final moments. Sarah, who had gone home the night before and slept very little, woke up to hundreds of notifications. The world was talking about Jack. More than just the murder he committed, more than his execution, it was his love for Max that had captured hearts everywhere. It was the one thing that made people pause. She watched the video, too. She couldn't help it. And she felt the same overwhelming wave of emotion that everyone else did. But unlike the world, she had the context. She knew Jack had changed. That dog had given him something everyone else had abandoned, a chance at redemption. "I hope you're seeing this, Jack," she whispered to herself as she watched Max wag his tail again in the video. "I hope you see that you're more than your worst moment." Meanwhile, in Fort Worth, Linda at the sanctuary took a deep breath after receiving dozens of calls from reporters. Max's life had become a symbol of something greater, something that no one had predicted. His presence, and the love between him and Jack, had touched people in ways they never imagined. "People are asking if we'll let Max be adopted," Linda said aloud to her assistant. "But I don't know. He's not ready. Maybe he never will be." Max had become more than just Jack's dog. He was the thread that connected the broken parts of Jack's story, and perhaps even of the nation's. Then came the unexpected twist. A well-known lawyer, Jenna Mallory, posted a video of her own, addressing the public. She was known for her outspoken views on criminal justice reform. "This video shows a man who was seeking redemption at the end of his life," Jenna began. "But there's more to this. What if Jack wasn't the only one who needed mercy? We've been so focused on punishment, but perhaps this is the moment we need to rethink the system. We need to ask, who are we when we only see a crime, and not a person?" The media storm continued to build, and as the video made its way through more and more channels, the central question loomed larger than ever before: what is justice? Was it enough to simply execute Jack, to close the book on his crime? Or did his last act of love, his final wish, demand something else? Could the nation come to terms with this new view of redemption, forgiveness, and humanity? The world was asking. And as more and more people questioned the meaning of Jack's execution, one thing became clear: the world had just witnessed something no one would soon forget. The morning after the video went viral, things changed. The headlines were everywhere. America's death penalty in question after viral video. Jack Raymond's final act of love stirs national debate. But amidst the emotional waves and public debate, one question stood apart: what happens next? For many, Jack's death had seemed like the inevitable end of his story. But now, something much bigger had been set into motion. The viral video had touched a nerve. It was no longer just about Jack Raymond, the man who had committed murder, served time, and was executed. It was about the larger system of justice. And as the story unraveled, it would force the nation to confront its own beliefs about punishment, mercy, and redemption. Jenna Mallory, the lawyer who had made the viral video about Jack's final moments, quickly became the voice of a movement. The legal community was divided, but her passionate plea for justice reform resonated with many. She framed the conversation as one of human dignity, urging that the nation reconsider the true purpose of the criminal justice system. Jack Raymond may have committed a heinous crime, Jenna said in an interview. But his final act, his final moment with the one being who had never abandoned him, reminds us that no person is beyond redemption. The fact that our society allows a man to be executed without ever fully reckoning with his humanity is a moral failure. The national debate about the death penalty intensified. And though the movement was gaining traction, it wasn't without opposition. On the other side, conservative figures, many of whom had previously supported Jack's execution, took to media outlets to defend the current system. "A man who killed another has no right to be forgiven," said Victor James, a prominent political commentator. "While I understand the emotional pull of that video, we cannot allow emotion to cloud justice. Justice is about accountability. It's about ensuring society is protected from people like Jack Raymond. His act of love doesn't erase the fact that he took a life." Fox News hosted heated debates on whether compassion could, or should, play any role in capital punishment. "What happened with Jack Raymond is tragic," one panelist argued. "But we have to be clear-eyed here. The law is the law. We cannot allow these emotional, sensational moments to dictate policy." Meanwhile, back at the Fort Worth Animal Sanctuary, the legal ramifications of the viral video were just beginning to surface. Linda, the sanctuary coordinator, had received multiple calls from lawyers, all offering different perspectives on what had happened with Max. It was clear that Jack's final act, whether intended or not, had launched a broader conversation. And with Max now an unlikely symbol of redemption and love, animal rights organizations were weighing in. Could Max be part of a larger campaign for prison reform? Could Jack's story be used to shift public opinion on the treatment of animals within the criminal justice system? Linda wasn't sure where she stood. She only knew one thing: Max's story had become far more important than the sanctuary's usual work. The dog was now a public figure, his image plastered everywhere. And with that came pressure to make decisions about his future. The legal fight for Jack Raymond's story would soon be played out in the courts. Jenna Mallory filed a formal petition to have Jack's case reviewed. Not in the sense of a posthumous appeal, Jack's execution was final. But rather, Jenna argued that the case demonstrated a systemic failure. Her aim was to challenge the legitimacy of the death penalty as a whole, using Jack's final moments as the focal point. "We cannot separate the legal from the moral," Jenna argued in her legal brief. Jack Raymond may have been condemned for his crime, but he was also condemned by a system that failed to see his capacity for change. The petition caught fire. Public outcry reached new levels, and even the U.S. Supreme Court was forced to acknowledge the growing unrest. However, Kayla Reed, the daughter of the man Jack had murdered, felt more conflicted than ever. The legal push to revisit the death penalty stirred something deep inside her, but it wasn't clear what. Her father's death still hung over her like a shadow, and she couldn't forget the man Jack had been at the time of his crime. What if Jack never truly changed? Kayla asked herself. What if he just found a way to fool us all in the end? The media turned to her for a statement. She hadn't commented much since the execution. But now, people wanted to know what she thought about the legal battle surrounding Jack's death. When Kayla was finally interviewed on NBC News, she admitted she didn't know how she felt. "Part of me wants to fight for justice. The kind of justice my father would have wanted," she said quietly. "But then there's this part of me that's torn. I don't know if I can forgive him. Even after everything." Her words struck a chord. In some ways, they summed up the national dilemma. Forgiveness was a powerful thing, but it didn't come easily. And the truth was, some wounds were too deep to ever truly heal. The legal ramifications of Jack's death were more than just a legal battle. They became a cultural and political one. Reformers wanted to use his story to question the foundation of the death penalty. Conservatives wanted to hold firm to the idea of absolute justice, even if that meant sacrificing compassion for the sake of law and order. As the legal case worked its way through the courts, Jenna Mallory continued to speak out, publicly and loudly. "We've always asked if the death penalty is just," she said during one of her interviews. "But now, I'm asking, is it humane?" Her words rippled through the country, forcing people to confront their own biases. Even those who had once been staunch supporters of the death penalty began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Jack's final act had revealed something that could not be ignored. But for all the legal and public drama, one thing remained: Jack Raymond's execution had opened a wound in America's justice system. And whether it healed or became more painful would depend on how the nation decided to move forward. What do you think? Is the death penalty broken, or is Jack's story just an anomaly? How does the law balance justice and mercy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. In the weeks following the viral video, Jack Raymond's story continued to captivate the nation. His final act with Max had struck a deep chord, igniting debates on justice, punishment, and the capacity for human growth. But amidst the escalating legal and public discourse, one voice emerged that no one could have anticipated. Former prosecutor turned advocate Victor Stone, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to the law and his unwavering belief in strict justice, was not someone anyone expected to stand on the side of mercy. In fact, during his career, he had been known for securing death penalties in some of the most high-profile cases. He was a tough, hard-nosed prosecutor who made his name by advocating for justice without compassion. But now, out of nowhere, Victor Stone appeared at a press conference, his appearance shocking many. His weathered face, his sharp suit, and his commanding presence had made him one of the most respected, and feared, figures in the legal world. But when he stepped in front of the microphone, his words took everyone by surprise. "I'm here today because I believe we've all missed the most important point in this entire conversation," Victor began, his deep voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We are so consumed with whether Jack Raymond deserved to die that we've forgotten something fundamental: Jack Raymond's humanity." The room fell silent. Sarah, sitting in the back of the crowd, gasped in disbelief. She knew Victor's history. She had followed his career, particularly his work on the notorious cases where he had argued for the death penalty. And now here he was, standing as an advocate for the very thing he had spent most of his life opposing. Victor continued, his words measured but passionate, the tension in the room palpable. "I've spent years prosecuting people. I've been the one to ask for the death sentence. And I can't count the number of times I thought about those people. Thought about their lives, their actions, and the consequences of those actions. But in Jack's case, after everything that's come to light, I've realized something. We didn't just fail him, we failed the entire system of justice." Victor's admission took the legal world by storm. For years, he had been a staunch advocate for capital punishment, and yet, he was now speaking out against it. He continued, his voice rising with conviction. Jack Raymond was not a monster. He was a man who, at the end of his life, showed more compassion and love than most of us can say we ever did. That video, his last wish to see his dog, tells us something important. It tells us that people can change. And if we continue to ignore that possibility, we are no better than the very system we claim to uphold. The room erupted with a mix of applause and stunned silence. Many were skeptical of Victor's motives, but there was no denying the weight of his words. His public admission was a sharp pivot, a 180-degree turn from the man he had been for decades. Sarah, who had followed Victor's career closely, felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, she was grateful for his voice, which lent a new kind of legitimacy to the reform movement. But on the other hand, she couldn't help but feel a lingering bitterness. Was Victor Stone simply riding the wave of public sentiment? Or had he truly come to believe in the mercy he was advocating for? Later that day, Sarah met with Jenna Mallory to discuss the unexpected turn of events. "I didn't expect this," Sarah admitted, shaking her head. "Victor Stone, of all people. It's surreal." Jenna, as always, remained calm, her voice steady. "Surreal, yes. But think about what this means. If someone like Victor Stone, someone with his background, can stand up and call for mercy, it shows that we're not just making noise. We're moving the needle." Sarah nodded, but her mind was still in turmoil. She couldn't help but think of her father, the man who had been murdered, and the pain that Jack's actions had caused. How could someone like Victor Stone, who had spent his entire career demanding retribution, now argue for mercy? The legal ramifications of Victor's newfound stance were immense. The media immediately began to cover his statements, with both praise and skepticism. Critics called him a turncoat, accusing him of opportunism, while others hailed him as a voice of reason in the conversation about criminal justice reform. Despite the mixed reactions, Victor's influence was undeniable. His public support of Jack Raymond's case drew attention from all sides, and soon, more prominent figures in the legal world began to reconsider their own positions on the death penalty. For Jenna Mallory, Victor's sudden shift was a breakthrough. She had always believed in reform, but this added weight to her argument. Now, she wasn't just speaking alone, she had a former prosecutor, a man with the power to sway opinions, by her side. But even with the growing momentum, things weren't easy. Opponents of the movement continued to rally against it, claiming that mercy had no place in a justice system that had to hold people accountable. Victor, however, stood firm in his beliefs, making waves in the legal world. "This isn't about excusing what Jack did," Victor explained in a follow-up interview. "This is about recognizing that every human life is more than their worst mistake." The conversation shifted. No longer was it about whether Jack Raymond deserved death. Now, the question was, what does justice truly mean? Is it about retribution? Or is it about something deeper? Is it about healing? Forgiveness? The capacity to change? For Max, Jack's dog, the debate seemed irrelevant. He had spent the past few weeks at the sanctuary, adjusting to a new life without his owner. But even as he lay curled up in his bed, a symbol of Jack's enduring love, the conversation continued around him, one that would ultimately reshape the nation's view on justice and redemption. The impact of Victor Stone's shift in perspective was undeniable. And while there was still much to be decided, both legally and socially, his voice had planted a seed of change. The next steps were unclear, but one thing was certain, the system was under scrutiny like never before. As the legal battle over Jack Raymond's execution continued, something unexpected happened. Public opinion on the death penalty began to shift in ways that even the most ardent reformers hadn't anticipated. What was once a deeply polarized issue, dividing the nation between those who believed in the sanctity of life and those who prioritized justice, became a national conversation about morality, empathy, and the fundamental question, what is justice? 1 month after Jack's execution and the viral video of his final moments with Max, a nationwide poll was conducted by a major media outlet. The results stunned many. Should the death penalty be abolished? 58% of Americans now favored reforming or abolishing the death penalty. 35% still supported its continued use. The remaining 7% remained undecided. The poll marked a stark shift in public opinion. In previous years, the support for the death penalty had been near 60%. Now, it seemed the majority of Americans were reconsidering its place in society, driven largely by Jack Raymond's story and the compelling arguments of figures like Victor Stone and Jenna Mallory. Victor Stone's role in shifting the public conversation was undeniable. His public statements had sparked debates in every corner of America, from coffee shops to universities, from political platforms to dinner tables. Many who had once supported the death penalty began to question whether the system truly delivered justice. They asked themselves whether an execution, like Jack's, was a reflection of the best of American ideals, or whether it was merely an outdated, cruel practice rooted in vengeance. One prominent political analyst, Sarah Williams, spoke to the media about the changing tide. There's a fundamental truth emerging from this debate. The death penalty is no longer just a political issue, it's a human issue. And when you start talking about humanity, you start asking deeper questions about fairness, redemption, and whether people can truly change. However, while the poll results indicated a shift, the nation remained deeply divided. The figures of opposition, the ones who still held fast to the death penalty, weren't going down without a fight. The media, especially conservative outlets, doubled down on their stance, emphasizing the importance of accountability and justice for victims. Kayla Reed, whose father's death had been at the hands of Jack Raymond, became an important voice in this ongoing conversation. She was increasingly called upon to speak publicly, and as much as she hated the attention, she realized that her position gave her a unique responsibility. Kayla still couldn't bring herself to forgive Jack, but she also understood that the national conversation had shifted. She couldn't ignore the stories of those who had found peace and healing through forgiveness. But would she ever be able to forgive him? In an interview with a prominent news network, Kayla was asked point-blank how she felt about the shift in public opinion. "I'm torn," Kayla admitted, her voice wavering. My father was taken from us in a brutal, senseless act. I can't just forget that. But then there's the video of Jack with his dog. It's so raw. I don't know how to feel. I think we have to ask ourselves whether we want a system of justice that's about retribution or a system that tries to heal." Her words reverberated through the nation. In many ways, Kayla's conflict became the emotional center of the entire debate. She represented the two sides of the argument, the deep, unyielding pain of losing a loved one, and the tentative hope for healing and redemption. While some news outlets offered balanced coverage of the situation, others took sides. Liberal media outlets, like MSNBC and the New York Times, began to frame Jack's story as one of human redemption. They interviewed Jenna Mallory regularly, amplifying her arguments for reform. Their coverage painted a picture of a justice system that was broken, one that lacked the compassion needed to fully embrace humanity. On the other hand, conservative media outlets, such as Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, doubled down on their support for the death penalty, portraying Jack's final moments as a manipulative stunt rather than an act of genuine love and growth. We cannot let a moment of sentimentality undo the decades of law that protect the safety of our society, argued one Fox News commentator. This is about the rule of law, not the rule of emotion. This stark contrast in media portrayals made it clear, the conversation was not just about Jack Raymond. It was about the soul of America itself. What did the nation truly value? Was it strict law and order? Or was it the possibility of redemption and second chances? Meanwhile, in the courtrooms, the legal proceedings continued to grind forward. The Supreme Court was now weighing whether to take up the question of death penalty reform, prompted by the surge of public opinion and the petition filed by Jenna Mallory. If the court decided to hear the case, it would set a monumental precedent. Lawyers for both sides, the defense and the prosecution, began preparing their arguments. But as the case moved forward, one fact was clear. The public opinion was shifting faster than the law itself could keep up. At the grassroots level, local protests were becoming more frequent. Advocacy groups like End the Death Penalty and Justice for All were gaining traction, organizing rallies, marches, and town halls across the country. Thousands of people were joining the fight to reform or abolish the death penalty, feeling that they could no longer stand by while such a divisive and morally complex system continued to operate. But not everyone agreed with the movement. Victims' rights organizations continued to argue that abolishing the death penalty would make America less safe. They claimed that justice for victims could only be achieved if those who took life were held to account in the most severe way possible. As the weeks passed, the public opinion on the death penalty continued to evolve. New polls came out every week, and the numbers kept swinging. At times, the reform movement seemed unstoppable, but at others, it seemed like the tide had receded, and the hardline views on justice would take back their ground. Yet, what remained consistent was the ongoing debate about what justice should truly look like. Was it revenge? Was it compassion? Was it about healing, or was it about deterrence? As the public waded deeper into this sea of questions, Jack Raymond's story remained at the heart of it all. The question wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of the nation. As the days ticked by, the mounting pressure surrounding Jack Raymond's case reached an intensity that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just about Jack anymore. The nation had shifted its gaze, and the death penalty was now the central issue. After weeks of public outcry, legal debates, and emotional appeals, Jenna Mallory and her team had taken the extraordinary step of filing a petition to the Supreme Court. The case they hoped to present would ultimately determine whether the death penalty in America could be reformed, or whether it would remain a tool of vengeance in the criminal justice system. The court's decision to hear the case marked a monumental moment. The nation held its breath as the justices prepared to review the arguments and hear the voices that had shaped the debate. And while Jack Raymond's fate still hung in the balance, the future of the nation's legal system seemed to hang on every word. Jenna Mallory and her legal team had known from the beginning that the Supreme Court would be their final battleground. The odds were against them, as the court had historically been reluctant to overturn precedent. The death penalty had been upheld for decades, despite growing concerns about its fairness, racial bias, and irreversibility. But with public opinion shifting, and more key figures like Victor Stone and Sarah Williams speaking out, they had managed to secure the backing they needed. The strategy was simple but risky. They argued that the death penalty was no longer in line with the values of modern society. It was inhumane, inefficient, and discriminatory. And the continued use of it, especially in cases like Jack's, threatened to tarnish America's standing as a moral leader in the world. The defense's argument centered around the evolving standard of decency, a principle the court had referenced in past rulings. They asserted that, just as the court had banned the execution of minors and the intellectually disabled, so too should it reconsider the execution of individuals who, like Jack, had shown signs of remorse and personal growth. However, the prosecution's position was staunch. They argued that Jack had committed heinous crimes and that, in a system of law based on deterrence and retribution, the death penalty was both a moral imperative and a necessary tool for protecting society. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The court's decision could send shockwaves across the legal system, changing the course of justice in America forever. On the morning of the Supreme Court hearing, a thick fog of anticipation hung over Washington, D.C. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, both in support of and in opposition to the death penalty. News vans lined the streets, and reporters from all over the world prepared to cover what was being billed as one of the most consequential cases in recent history. Inside the courtroom, Jenna Mallory, Victor Stone, and the rest of the defense team sat at their table, preparing for the battle ahead. Jenna, as always, remained calm, but a storm brewed inside her. She knew the weight of the moment. Jack's fate, and the fate of many like him, rested on their ability to sway the 9 justices who held the power to change everything. The proceedings began, and the Chief Justice, David Calloway, called the court to order. He was known for his intellectual rigor, and today, he seemed to wear the weight of history on his shoulders. "We are here today," the Chief Justice began, his voice steady, to address a fundamental question. Can a nation founded on the principles of justice, mercy, and equality continue to uphold a practice as irreversible as the death penalty? And, more importantly, is the death penalty still an appropriate punishment in the modern era? Jenna Mallory felt the weight of those words. This was the moment. Every case, every trial, had led them here. The nation was watching, waiting for the court's decision. Jenna was the first to speak. Her voice, though soft, carried the gravitas of a woman fighting for a cause she deeply believed in. "Your Honors," she began, "this case is about more than just Jack Raymond. It is about who we are as a society. It is about what we value. Do we still believe in redemption, in the possibility that people can change? Or do we continue to perpetuate a cycle of violence and vengeance that does nothing to heal the wounds of society?" Her words were measured but filled with passion, the kind that comes from fighting not just for one person, but for an entire system of justice that she believed could be better. Jack Raymond has shown us the possibility of change. He has shown us compassion at the end of his life, an act that has touched the hearts of millions. His story is one of deep humanity, and it is a reminder that we are not defined by our worst mistakes, but by the capacity to learn and to grow. Jenna's argument was powerful. It was not just a legal argument, it was an emotional one. She spoke directly to the humanity of Jack Raymond, and in doing so, she reminded the justices of the core values the country had been built on. When it was the prosecution's turn, the Attorney General, Rachel Harper, stood up with an air of determination. She was a seasoned prosecutor, and she was not about to let this case challenge the foundational principles of American justice without a fight. "Your Honors," she began, her voice resolute, "this is not a matter of emotion. This is a matter of law. The law exists to protect the innocent and to ensure that justice is served. Jack Raymond's crimes were heinous, and he was sentenced under a system that, despite its flaws, is based on fairness and due process." Rachel Harper continued, emphasizing that deterrence was a vital part of criminal law, and that society's safety relied on the certainty that those who committed the most egregious acts would face the ultimate consequence. "If we begin to allow exceptions based on feelings of mercy, we will open the floodgates for future injustice. The law is about upholding justice, not emotions." As the arguments continued, the tension in the courtroom grew palpable. Each of the justices listened intently, weighing the significance of the case. Some appeared more sympathetic to the defense, while others seemed firm in their belief that the death penalty was necessary for the protection of society. The Chief Justice remained silent, his eyes fixed on the attorneys before him, occasionally jotting notes on his legal pad. The other justices, however, seemed divided. Justice Thomas, known for his conservative stance, appeared unmoved by the emotional appeal of the defense, while Justice Stevens, more liberal in his views, appeared more open to the idea of reform. But there was one voice that Jenna had not anticipated, the voice of Justice Miller, a swing vote who had kept her cards close to her chest throughout the proceedings. "I understand the gravity of this issue," Justice Miller said, his voice calm yet weighted with years of judicial experience. "But we must also recognize that the law cannot evolve based on the public's emotional reaction to a single case. This court must consider not just Jack Raymond's actions, but the greater implications of altering the fundamental nature of American justice." As the arguments concluded, the justices retired to deliberate, and the courtroom remained silent. The future of the death penalty rested in their hands. The nation could only wait, wondering whether Jack's last wish would lead to a new chapter in the country's approach to justice, or whether the system would remain unchanged, unwavering in its commitment to punishment over mercy. The Supreme Court's deliberation in the case of Jack Raymond was proving to be nothing less than a national spectacle. As days turned into weeks, the tension that had been building in the courtroom continued to simmer. For those on the front lines, Jenna Mallory, Victor Stone, and the countless individuals whose lives had been shaped by Jack's story, the world seemed to stop as they waited for the final decision. The weight of this case was no longer just a legal matter, it had become a moral reckoning for a nation at a crossroads. The question was no longer simply about whether Jack Raymond should be executed, but whether the death penalty itself was a reflection of who America was, or who it wanted to be. For weeks, the justices of the Supreme Court sat in silence, poring over every argument, every precedent, and every moral dilemma the case presented. The nation had been on edge, with news outlets and social media buzzing with speculation. Every movement of the justices seemed to fuel the fire, and the public waited with bated breath. The national polls, which had been shifting in favor of death penalty reform, seemed to be on everyone's mind. The momentum was undeniable, a growing movement for change that had reached the highest levels of government. But the legal system moved slowly, and the Supreme Court was not easily swayed by public opinion. This was a system rooted in precedent and constitutional interpretation, and changing it would require more than just emotion. It would require a fundamental shift in how justice was viewed in America. For Jenna Mallory, the waiting was the hardest part. The young lawyer had poured every ounce of her energy into this case. She had worked tirelessly, sacrificing her personal life, her health, and her peace of mind to ensure that Jack's story, his redemption, his final moments of humanity, was heard and understood by the justices. But now, as the weeks dragged on, the weight of the unknown pressed down on her. The toll it was taking on her emotionally was visible. At home, she found it hard to sleep, the quiet moments filled with the echoes of Jack's voice, the memories of his final days and his requests. She couldn't help but replay those moments in her mind, wondering if she had done enough. Jenna's thoughts wandered back to that first moment she had met Jack, when he had still been a prisoner, cold and hardened by years behind bars. She had believed, like so many others, that he was beyond saving. But over time, Jack had shown her something different. She had watched him transform. The man who had once been a killer had, in his final moments, exhibited a deep and undeniable sense of love, for his dog, for the family he had never known. Jack Raymond had found his humanity in the most unexpected place, through an act of pure love. That love had been the spark that ignited a movement. It had opened a door to the possibility of redemption in a way that few could have ever imagined. Yet Jenna knew all too well that redemption was a double-edged sword. It wasn't just about Jack Raymond. It was about the safety of society, the protection of the innocent, and the moral fabric of the nation. Could a country that prided itself on justice afford to show mercy to someone like Jack? Or was mercy only reserved for the innocent, the helpless? Victor Stone, the charismatic activist who had championed Jack's cause from the beginning, was also struggling with the uncertainty. The past few weeks had seen him become an influential figure in the media, making powerful speeches and leading protests for death penalty reform. His face had appeared on national television, his name becoming synonymous with the movement to end capital punishment. But even for Victor, the fight had taken a toll. The pressure was immense. His personal life had taken a back seat to his advocacy, and at times, he found himself questioning whether all of this would amount to anything. Would the court take the risk of overturning centuries of precedent? One evening, as Victor sat in his office preparing for another rally, he received a call from Jenna Mallory. Her voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Victor, do you ever wonder if we've done enough?" she asked, her words laced with doubt. "I've given everything I have to this case, but sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it. What if we lose? What if this entire movement, Jack's story, everything we've fought for, just crumbles?" Victor was quiet for a moment, understanding the weight of her words. He had seen Jenna's struggle firsthand, and he knew how deeply she cared. He also knew that she had become the symbol of hope for a movement that was gaining ground in a divided nation. "We've done more than enough, Jenna," he finally said, his voice steady. "We've opened a door. Whether or not the court decides to walk through it, that's beyond our control. But we've already changed the conversation. And that's something." Outside the legal and activist circles, the nation was in suspended animation. The public was divided, some hoped for a breakthrough, others feared it. The media continued to cover the case, with headlines shouting about the weight of the decision, the political ramifications, and the moral questions at stake. At one rally, Kayla Reed, the daughter of Jack's victim, gave an impassioned speech to a crowd of thousands, her voice echoing through the streets. She spoke not just about Jack's death, but about the trauma she still carried from losing her father. "I've spent months trying to understand how I can forgive," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "But how can you forgive someone who took everything from you? And how can a society choose mercy for those who are guilty? Kayla's words were met with a mixture of applause and silence. For some, they were a powerful reminder of the pain caused by Jack's actions. For others, they served as a stark reminder that the conversation around justice was far from simple. As the clock ticked on, a decision was expected within the next week. The justices were deliberating, weighing the arguments, considering the precedents, and calculating the ramifications of their ruling. The country was watching, and the world was waiting. Jenna stood before her office window late one night, gazing at the empty streets of Washington, D.C. She couldn't help but feel as though everything had led to this moment. Would Jack Raymond's story become a turning point in American justice? Or would the nation continue down the path it had walked for centuries, one defined by retribution, fear, and the belief that some lives were more expendable than others? Jenna's final thought as she turned away from the window was simple, yet profound. This decision would change everything. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. The Supreme Court's decision on the case of Jack Raymond would be announced. The entire nation held its collective breath, waiting for the news that would change the course of history, or solidify a tradition that had been ingrained in the country for centuries. Across America, newsrooms were ready, prepared for the verdict that would either shake the foundations of the justice system or reaffirm its oldest tenets. Jenna Mallory, Victor Stone, and the countless others who had poured their hearts into this case could do nothing but wait. Their fates, and perhaps the fate of many others, rested in the hands of 9 justices. For Jack Raymond, who sat alone in his cell, it was the longest night of his life. The clock on the wall ticked with an almost unbearable slowness. As he stared out of the tiny window in his cell, he wondered if this would be his last night alive. Would he die tomorrow? Or would the court show mercy, granting him a chance to live? It was just after 10 a.m. when the news broke. A single email notification from the Supreme Court website pinged in the inboxes of millions across the nation. The headline was simple, but its weight was monumental. Supreme Court rules on death penalty case, Jack Raymond to be granted a new trial. A collective gasp seemed to echo from coast to coast. Jenna Mallory read the headline in disbelief, her hands trembling as she stared at the screen. She had hoped, even prayed, for a decision in favor of reform, but this? This was more than she had ever imagined. A new trial, she thought. It wasn't just a small victory, it was a massive step toward justice, toward showing the world that the system could change, that mercy was possible. Meanwhile, across town, Victor Stone saw the same news and immediately grabbed his phone. He dialed Jenna's number, his heart racing as the line rang. The sound of her breath on the other end was the only indication he needed that she was still processing the monumental ruling. "Did you see it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't believe it," Jenna replied. It's happening. This is it." The shock of the decision was still settling over them both. For months, they had fought for Jack Raymond's life, and now it seemed as though their efforts had not been in vain. The Supreme Court's ruling was more than just a verdict in favor of Jack Raymond, it was a sweeping decision that challenged the legitimacy of the death penalty itself. By granting Jack a new trial, the court set a new precedent, one that would allow a reassessment of the use of capital punishment based on evolving standards of decency. In their opinion, the court acknowledged the growing public sentiment that the death penalty was inhumane, stating, "The application of the death penalty in cases where the individual demonstrates remorse and a capacity for reform contradicts the foundational principles of justice and rehabilitation. The evolving moral standards of our society demand a re-evaluation of its continued use." Jenna sat back in her chair, absorbing the magnitude of the decision. This was not just a victory for Jack, it was a victory for all those who had been condemned to death under the belief that mercy had no place in the criminal justice system. This ruling was the beginning of a national conversation about whether the death penalty had any place in a country that prided itself on justice, equality, and human rights. But as Jenna digested the news, a tinge of anxiety crept in. While the ruling meant Jack would live to face a new trial, it also meant that he would have to go through another round of court battles. It wasn't over yet. The court had given him a second chance, but it would be up to the lower courts and eventually a jury to decide whether Jack would live or die. In his prison cell, Jack had seen the guards move through the hallways with an unusual sense of urgency. The atmosphere had changed overnight. His life felt like it was hanging by a thread, but when the news reached him, it was like a wave crashing over him. For the first time in years, Jack felt hope. It was Officer Daniels, a guard who had been sympathetic to Jack's case, who brought the news to him. Daniels knocked gently on the door of Jack's cell and waited for the response. "Raymond," Daniels called out, his voice low. "You're gonna want to hear this." Jack walked toward the door, his hands shaking. "What is it?" he asked. "You've got a chance, man. The Supreme Court ruled. You're getting a new trial." For a moment, Jack stood motionless, as though the words hadn't fully sunk in. Then, slowly, he allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine one in years. He sank down onto the edge of his bed, feeling the weight of the news. A new trial. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in a long time, Jack Raymond felt that his story wasn't over. The news spread like wildfire, and reactions poured in from every corner of the nation. Some cheered the decision, seeing it as a sign that the country was ready to embrace mercy and second chances. Activists who had rallied behind Jack's case declared the ruling a victory for justice and humanity. "This is a monumental day for America," said Sarah Williams, a leading advocate for prison reform. "It's proof that we, as a society, can change. We can be better." But not everyone was pleased with the decision. Opponents of death penalty reform argued that the court had overstepped its bounds. Kayla Reed, the daughter of Jack's victim, was among the most vocal critics. "I'm furious," she told reporters. "Jack Raymond's actions destroyed my family, and now he gets another chance. What message does that send to the victims of crime? How is that justice?" Her words struck a chord with those who believed in the sanctity of the death penalty and the importance of retribution. The decision sparked an immediate debate on social media, with some praising the court's courage and others condemning it as a step too far. For Jenna Mallory, the victory was bittersweet. While she was proud of the ruling, she knew the battle was far from over. The new trial would be another hard-fought war, one that would drag up painful memories, painful testimonies, and perhaps even force the public to confront the uncomfortable truths about the justice system. And for Jack, the uncertainty would continue. His fate had not been decided yet. The court's ruling had simply given him a second chance, and he would have to fight to prove that he was no longer the man who had committed those unspeakable acts all those years ago. But in that moment, Jack Raymond had what he had not had for years. Hope. And for Jenna, Victor, and the millions of Americans who had followed Jack's story, hope was all they could cling to. The decision had been made. Jack Raymond was going to face a new trial. After the shock of the Supreme Court's ruling, the celebrations in the reform camp were brief. The fight was far from over. This new chapter in Jack's life would be just as difficult, if not more so, than the previous one. For Jenna Mallory, it was both a chance for redemption and a burden that weighed heavily on her. She sat in her office, reviewing legal documents. It had been weeks since the court's decision, and the anticipation of the upcoming trial had become a constant pressure. Jack had been moved to a new facility, one where he would prepare with his new defense team. The case was about to go back to the very beginning, the courtroom, the jury, the public gaze. Jenna had always believed in justice. She had believed that everyone deserved a second chance. But now, as she thought about what lay ahead, the truth was hard to face. The trial would be a grueling process, one that would bring out all the painful details of Jack's past crimes. The media would be there, ready to broadcast every moment to the nation. There would be testimonies from victims' families, protesters from both sides, and an emotional public on edge, wondering if the justice system was truly capable of offering redemption. Could Jack, who had committed such horrific acts, ever truly redeem himself? As Jenna prepared for the trial, she found herself questioning everything. She had spent months fighting for Jack's life, pouring herself into the case. But now that the trial was actually happening, her doubts began to surface. Would the new trial really bring justice? Or would it just open old wounds, bringing more suffering to the families affected by Jack's actions? Her thoughts turned to Kayla Reed, the daughter of Jack's victim. She couldn't help but feel the deep pain Kayla must be feeling. For Kayla, Jack's redemption was an insult, a reminder of everything she had lost. Jenna knew the new trial would dredge up memories that no one wanted to face. But how could they move forward without confronting the past? On the other side of the debate stood Victor Stone. He had been with Jenna since the beginning of Jack's case, advocating for the reform of the death penalty and for Jack's right to be heard. But as the new trial loomed closer, even Victor found himself struggling with the complexity of the situation. He had believed in Jack's redemption, but now he was starting to question whether Jack's past could ever truly be overcome. The trial was going to be a spectacle, one that would once again force the world to face the horror of what Jack had done. And Victor, too, was feeling the emotional toll of the case. Victor sat at his desk late one night, scribbling in his journal. What happens when redemption feels like a lie? What happens when the price of mercy is too high? He wondered how long he could keep pushing for a cause that seemed to pull in so many directions. He was a warrior for justice, but now, in the shadow of the new trial, he found himself asking whether he was fighting for the right reasons, or if he was simply prolonging the inevitable. The trials had been a painful experience. But he couldn't back out now. Too many people were relying on him. Jack was counting on him, Jenna was counting on him, and maybe, just maybe, he was also counting on himself. Inside the prison, Jack Raymond was getting ready for his new trial. The last few months had been a whirlwind. After the Supreme Court ruling, he had been moved to a facility where he could meet with his new defense attorneys and prepare for the case that would decide his future. His new legal team was eager to help him, but Jack was deeply aware of the challenges ahead. He spent hours each day in the small, sterile meeting room, poring over the case files and reviewing the strategies that his lawyers had devised. But as much as he tried to immerse himself in the legal intricacies of his defense, it was the emotional weight that kept pulling him back. He couldn't escape the truth, his actions had caused unbearable pain for countless people. As he reviewed his past, the magnitude of his crime loomed over him like a constant, unshakable shadow. The weight of Kayla's loss, the lives he had shattered, it was all too much to bear at times. Jack often found himself staring out the small window of his cell, lost in thought. Was it possible to redeem himself after all this? Could he ever truly be forgiven for the horrors he had inflicted? As the trial approached, Jenna and Victor's relationship began to show signs of strain. Both had been so deeply invested in the cause that they had grown closer than either of them had anticipated. But now, as the trial grew closer, they found themselves in constant disagreement. Jenna was exhausted, emotionally and physically. She had always been the one to keep fighting, but now she wasn't sure how much more she could give. "Victor," she said one evening, her voice tight with frustration, "I'm scared. I'm scared that we're just dragging this out. We're reopening old wounds, and I don't know if Jack can ever truly be redeemed. How do we keep asking for mercy when it feels like we're just hurting more people?" Victor sat across from her, his eyes filled with concern. He knew this moment was coming. He had seen the toll the case had taken on Jenna, and now, in this quiet, vulnerable moment, he realized that maybe he wasn't the only one struggling to reconcile his ideals with the realities of the case. "I know it's hard," Victor said, his voice gentle. "But we can't turn back now. We've come too far. Jack deserves his chance, and maybe, just maybe, that chance can help bring something good out of all this pain." Jenna closed her eyes, trying to find the strength to push forward. She had always believed in the cause, but now she wondered if there was more at stake than just Jack's life. Was this fight truly about redemption, or was it just about confronting a system that might never change? As the days ticked down to the start of the trial, the eyes of the nation were on the small courthouse where Jack would face the music once again. The press had already begun setting up for the event, preparing for the dramatic courtroom scenes that were sure to unfold. For the families of victims, for Kayla Reed, this trial would be a painful reminder of everything they had lost. And for Jack Raymond, it would be his last chance to prove that he had changed, that he was no longer the man he had been when he committed those unspeakable acts. The new trial would be a fresh start, but it would also be a painful replay of everything Jack had done, and it would decide whether he truly deserved the second chance he had fought so. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. It had been months since the Supreme Court's decision, and now the moment was finally here. Jack Raymond's new trial was underway. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and the sharp click of heels echoed against the marble floors. Every inch of the room was packed with journalists, photographers, and the families of both the victims and the accused. The stakes had never been higher. The air was thick with tension, a palpable energy that seemed to hum in the background. On one side of the room sat Jenna Mallory, her expression determined but weary. She had spent months preparing for this moment, but the reality of it was now pressing down on her in a way that nothing else had. She was Jack's last hope, and she couldn't afford to falter. The weight of her responsibility was heavier than ever. At the defense table, Victor Stone sat beside her. His fingers drummed nervously on the table, his mind racing with strategies, contingencies, and a constant cycle of what-ifs. The case was simple, yet infinitely complex. The question wasn't whether Jack was guilty, but whether he deserved to die for what he had done. Could the jury see beyond the heinous actions he'd committed? Was redemption possible? Across from them, in stark contrast, sat Kayla Reed, the daughter of one of Jack's victims. Her presence was a solemn reminder of the real human cost of Jack's crimes. Her eyes, cold and unyielding, flicked between the defense and the prosecution. Kayla had made it clear in the media that she wanted Jack to pay for his actions, no matter the cost. She had lost everything, and now she was here to ensure that justice was served. The judge entered, signaling the beginning of the trial. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the creak of chairs. The prosecution began their opening statements. The prosecutor, Derek West, stood tall and confident, his voice cutting through the silence. He was a seasoned veteran of the legal system, known for his no-nonsense approach. He wasted no time in laying out the stark facts of the case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," West began, his voice steady but full of conviction. "What we have here is a man who committed unspeakable acts of violence. Jack Raymond did not act in a moment of passion or in self-defense, he chose to end lives. And no amount of remorse can erase the horror he brought into the lives of innocent families. While the defense may paint him as a man who deserves redemption, let us not forget what brought us here: the loss of lives, families destroyed, and an unrepentant killer who is now asking for mercy." West's words echoed in the room, and Jenna felt the weight of them like a punch to the gut. Kayla Reed sat rigidly in her seat, her face stone-like. Her mother's life had been taken by Jack, and now the law was giving him another chance to live. For Kayla, there was no room for mercy, just the desire for retribution. The prosecution's case was clear. Jack Raymond had committed a series of brutal murders and deserved to face the death penalty for his actions. There would be no room for empathy in their argument. Jack had already been given a second chance at life through the Supreme Court ruling, and now it was time for the ultimate price to be paid. When it was time for the defense to speak, Jenna Mallory stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, but she forced herself to focus. Jack's life was in her hands. This was the moment she had been working toward, and she couldn't afford to let emotion cloud her judgment. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Jenna began, her voice unwavering. "We are here today not to deny the crimes Jack Raymond committed, but to ask you to see the man before you as more than the sum of his actions. Yes, he was responsible for terrible crimes, crimes that have caused unimaginable pain for the victims and their families. But Jack has changed. He has shown remorse, he has worked hard to understand the pain he caused, and he is ready to make amends. Jenna paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. She knew she had to convince the jury that Jack was worthy of a second chance that he had earned, despite the darkness of his past. We ask you to consider that justice is not about retribution alone. It is also about redemption, healing, and forgiveness. We ask you to see the humanity in Jack. The same humanity that he now seeks to rebuild, not just for his sake, but for the sake of the families he has hurt. As Jenna spoke, she stole a glance at Jack. He sat quietly, his face a mask of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Jack had been preparing for this moment for months, but the reality of it was now consuming him. Was he worthy of mercy? Could he truly be redeemed after everything he had done? It was a battle of ideologies, punishment versus rehabilitation. The case wasn't just about Jack anymore. It was about the very nature of the justice system and what it meant to be truly free from the sins of the past. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was intense. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the trial. The case had captured the national spotlight once again, and the debate over Jack's fate was playing out in real time for the world to see. Social media was flooded with comments, both supporting and opposing Jack's bid for redemption. Some called him a hero for seeking change, while others labeled him a monster who deserved no mercy. The divide was deep, and the trial was far from over. As the day wore on, the courtroom drama unfolded in front of the nation. For Jenna Mallory and Victor Stone, the stakes had never been higher. Their arguments had been made, their positions clear, but the decision was now in the hands of the jury. Jack Raymond's fate would soon be sealed. Would the jury see him as a man who could still change, or would they see only the ghost of his past crimes, forever tarnishing any chance at redemption? The days after the closing arguments were some of the longest Jack had ever endured. The courtroom was quieter now, the buzz of conversation replaced by a still, oppressive silence. The jury deliberations had begun. As the defense and prosecution sat in their separate rooms, the atmosphere in the courthouse was tense. The air seemed to hang heavy with the weight of what was to come. Jenna Mallory paced the small, sparse room where she had been waiting for any sign of movement. Her mind raced, each scenario unfolding with a terrifying sense of inevitability. She had spent months fighting for Jack's second chance. Her belief in the system of redemption had pushed her to argue his case before the jury. But as she stared at the door, waiting for someone to come in and deliver the news, she couldn't help but feel the gnawing fear of what might come next. Victor Stone, sitting next to her, shared the same anxiety. The quiet, relentless tension between them had become almost unbearable. They had seen the same arguments, heard the same testimonies, and now they waited for the final judgment. The weight of their work, of their emotional investment, felt almost too much to carry. They had done everything they could, but in the end, the decision would lie with 12 strangers in a room who had to decide Jack's fate. It was a humbling reminder of how fragile hope could be. Inside the jury room, the deliberations had begun. The 12 men and women gathered around the table, each carrying the burden of the decision they were about to make. Rachel Miller, the jury forewoman, cleared her throat. She glanced around the room, feeling the collective weight of the responsibility they had taken on. The case was complicated, and everyone in the room knew that their verdict would have far-reaching consequences. "Okay, everyone, let's get started," Rachel said, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it. "We all know why we're here. It's not easy, but we need to take our time with this. We're not just deciding if Jack Raymond deserves mercy. We're deciding whether he lives or dies." The words hung in the air, and there was a moment of uncomfortable silence before anyone spoke. One of the male jurors, Mark, shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed in thought. "I can't shake the feeling that the prosecution's case was just so clear," Mark said. "Jack Raymond committed horrific acts. People died. It's hard to look past that, no matter what he's done since." Another juror, Linda, nodded solemnly. She had been personally moved by the defense's argument, the possibility that redemption was real, that people could change, and that the justice system should allow for growth. But what if we're wrong? Linda asked quietly. What if Jack really has changed? What if this is his chance to make things right? The room became quieter as the other jurors thought it over. Megan, a younger juror, shook her head. It's hard to think of him as a changed man. The things he did, how can we just let that go? She asked, her voice cracking slightly. The discussions continued, ebbing and flowing between the two extremes of punishment and mercy. Some jurors were firm in their belief that Jack's actions had been unforgivable, while others couldn't deny the possibility of redemption, especially after seeing his remorse. As the minutes passed, the tension grew, and each juror wrestled with the moral and ethical dilemmas that had come to define this case. Outside the jury room, Jenna Mallory could hardly contain herself. She had spent years of her life fighting for justice in the court system, but now, with Jack's life on the line, the process felt like an overwhelming weight. As she sat, her mind wandered back to the first time she had met Jack. He had been nothing like the man the media painted him as. He had been soft-spoken, remorseful, and genuinely interested in changing. She remembered his quiet words to her during their first meeting, "I never thought I'd be here. But now that I am. I want to make it right." Could she really believe that? Could anyone truly change after committing such heinous acts? She had spent countless hours reviewing his case, his letters, his remorse. She had witnessed his growth, his desire to understand the depth of the pain he caused. But now, as the jury deliberated, Jenna was unsure. She couldn't help but wonder if she had put all her faith in something that was ultimately unachievable. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and Jenna pulled it out to find a message from Victor. "I know this is hard. We've done everything we can. But now it's in their hands." She read the message over and over, clinging to it like a lifeline. But it didn't ease her fears. What if the jury couldn't see past Jack's crimes? What if they saw him as nothing more than a monster who deserved to pay with his life? On the other side of the courthouse, Kayla Reed sat in a small, private room. Her face was expressionless, but inside, she was fighting an emotional battle. The trial had reawakened the trauma she had buried for years. She had lost her mother to Jack Raymond's brutality, and now she was being forced to relive it all over again. As the jury deliberated, Kayla's thoughts were consumed with the faces of her mother's friends and family, the community that had been ripped apart by Jack's actions. Kayla had spoken out publicly many times, demanding that Jack pay for what he had done. Her heart ached for her mother, and in her mind, Jack could never truly atone for what he had taken from her. The idea of mercy, of redemption, was foreign to her. It felt like a slap in the face, a way of letting him off too easily. Yet, even as she felt this rage, part of her knew that a life sentence wouldn't bring her mother back. There would be no closure, no end to the pain. The verdict wouldn't heal her wounds, it would only reopen them. After hours of deliberation, the courtroom finally began to fill again. The jury had reached a verdict. Jenna stood up, her hands shaking, and glanced at Jack. His face was unreadable, though his eyes met hers with an intensity that spoke volumes. The judge entered the room, and the atmosphere in the courthouse grew heavy with anticipation. The jury forewoman, Rachel Miller, stood to read the verdict. "We, the jury, have reached a verdict," Rachel said, her voice firm but wavering slightly. "In the case of Jack Raymond, we find the defendant." Jenna's heart pounded in her chest. The moment she had feared, and longed for, was finally here. The courtroom was silent as the jury forewoman, Rachel Miller, stood with a piece of paper in her hand. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, waiting, holding their collective breath. Jenna Mallory stood beside Victor Stone, her heart racing, her palms sweating. Jack Raymond, seated beside his defense team, remained still, his eyes locked ahead, his face unreadable. The weight of the moment pressed down on them all. The moment of truth had arrived. Rachel Miller cleared her throat. The sound echoed through the stillness of the room, heightening the tension. "We, the jury, have reached a verdict," Rachel said, her voice steady but carrying the gravity of the situation. She paused for a moment, scanning the room. The audience, the families of the victims, the defense team, all waited for her to continue. Jenna's heart skipped a beat. She could hear the faint sounds of her own breath, her focus narrowing on Rachel's every movement. "In the case of Jack Raymond, we find the defendant." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow. Kayla Reed, seated in the audience, her eyes locked on the proceedings, held her breath. This was it. The moment of justice, or of devastation. Her face remained cold, her jaw clenched. She had spent so many sleepless nights in the courtroom, hoping for this very moment to arrive, praying for the outcome that would give her some sense of closure. But deep down, Kayla feared that no verdict could heal the wound Jack had caused. "Guilty of murder in the first degree." The words shattered the silence in an instant, causing a ripple of shock to sweep through the courtroom. Jenna felt her stomach drop as the room erupted in whispers, gasps, and murmurs. The prosecution's case had won out. The jury had found Jack guilty, despite the defense's arguments of redemption. Jenna's eyes locked onto Jack's, and for the first time in a long while, she saw the full weight of his remorse. His shoulders slumped, and for a brief moment, he seemed to shrink, as if the air had been sucked from the room. Victor Stone stood rigid beside her, his face stoic, betraying no emotion. He had known that this was a possibility, but the reality of it felt like a crushing blow. Jenna's mind spun as the gravity of the verdict sank in. She had worked tirelessly, spent every waking moment fighting for Jack's chance at redemption. She had truly believed in his ability to change, to make amends for his past. But now, standing in the wake of the jury's decision, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed him. Had it been worth it? She thought back to the first time she had met Jack, the raw emotion in his eyes as he spoke of his regret, his desire to atone for his sins. She had wanted to believe him, had wanted to believe that people could change, that there was hope even for someone as lost as Jack. But now, with the jury's verdict hanging over them, Jenna couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of doubt. The prosecution had succeeded in framing Jack as a killer, a monster whose actions were unforgivable, no matter the remorse he expressed. The question of redemption had been overshadowed by the desire for punishment. And now, the man who had been given a second chance by the Supreme Court was being sent back into the system, a convicted murderer. Jenna looked at Jack once more, her heart breaking for him. This wasn't how she had imagined this ending. The tears she had kept at bay now threatened to spill over. She had believed in the possibility of change, and yet the system had refused to give him the benefit of the doubt. Jack had been found guilty of a crime that, despite his remorse, could not be undone. For a brief moment, the reality of the verdict seemed to hit Jack in waves. His head hung low, his face a mixture of shock and sorrow. He had prepared himself for this possibility, but he hadn't truly believed it would come to this. He had hoped that, after everything he'd been through, there would be some kind of mercy, some kind of second chance. His mind raced back to the time when he had first committed his crimes, the rage and darkness that had consumed him. He remembered the faces of the victims, the lives he had taken, and the unimaginable pain he had caused. For so long, he had buried the guilt, the shame, telling himself he was beyond redemption. But when he had met Jenna, something had shifted inside him. He had wanted to change, to atone, to become the man he knew he could be. But the jury had spoken, and Jack was now facing a future that seemed darker than anything he could have imagined. He would not be allowed to atone for his sins outside the confines of a prison cell. The hope he had nurtured, the belief that maybe, just maybe, he could find peace, all of that seemed to slip through his fingers now. Jack felt a tear slip down his cheek. It was not the first time he had cried, but it felt different this time. It was a tear not of anger or regret, but of hopelessness. Across the room, Kayla Reed sat frozen. The words of the jury forewoman echoed in her ears, guilty of murder in the first degree. She had been so certain that Jack deserved justice, that the punishment he faced was the only way to make the world right again. But now that the verdict had been rendered, there was no satisfaction in it. Her mother's death, the loss of everything she had once held dear, those wounds were still fresh. But seeing Jack in this moment, broken and defeated, she felt a strange twinge of uncertainty. She had wanted him to pay for what he had done, but now that he had been found guilty, Kayla didn't know what would come next. There was no undoing what had been done, no way to fill the empty space her mother's death had left. But as she watched Jack, something inside her softened, just for a moment. The verdict had been rendered, but this was not the end of the trial. The next stage was sentencing. Jack's fate would soon be sealed by the judge. Death penalty or life in prison? That was the question now. Jenna's battle for mercy had not been won, but it was far from over. The next few days would determine whether Jack would have the chance to continue living, to seek redemption, or if this was the end of the line. Jenna looked at Jack one last time before the proceedings ended. The jury had spoken. But there was still time, a small sliver of hope, one last chance to plead for his life. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet intensity. The tension was palpable as everyone waited for the final phase of the trial, the sentencing. Jack Raymond had been found guilty of first-degree murder, and now, all eyes were on Judge Caroline Price, who would decide whether Jack would spend the rest of his life in prison or face the ultimate punishment, death. The stakes could not have been higher. Jenna Mallory sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly together. She had fought with everything she had to give Jack a second chance, but now, as the clock ticked closer to the moment of judgment, she felt a deep sense of helplessness. Her usual confidence had been replaced with anxiety, knowing that the final decision was out of her hands. Victor Stone, sitting beside her, was just as tense. He had been in the courtroom for years, but there was something uniquely suffocating about this moment. The tension in the air was different now, more personal. This wasn't just another case. This was Jack. A man he had come to know, a man who, despite his past, had shown true signs of remorse and change. Victor glanced at Jack, who was seated across from them. Jack had been unusually quiet. His face, usually a mask of calm, was now drawn, as if the weight of the coming sentence had drained him of all energy. Jack had lived through his crimes, had survived the prison system, but facing the possibility of the death penalty was a different kind of hell. It was the end of everything. Judge Caroline Price stood at the bench, preparing to address the courtroom. Her expression was stern, professional, and unyielding. She had been through countless cases in her career, but the weight of this one felt different. She had been tasked with handing down a sentence that would either offer Jack a chance at redemption or end his life. Her job was simple, to apply the law fairly. But as she glanced at Jack, she wondered if there was more at play here. Could someone like Jack truly change? Judge Price turned to the court reporter and nodded. The time has come for the court to determine the appropriate sentence in this case, she said, her voice steady but with a hint of emotion. The jury has found the defendant, Jack Raymond, guilty of first-degree murder. This is a crime that cannot be undone, and the law requires a response. The courtroom fell silent once again, the gravity of her words settling over everyone. Jenna's heart pounded as she waited for the judge to speak the words that would shape Jack's fate. The question before the court now is whether Jack Raymond will receive the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Judge Price continued, her eyes scanning the room. Before I make my ruling, I would like to hear from the defense and the prosecution regarding any statements or arguments. Jenna stood slowly, her legs unsteady, her hands shaking slightly as she approached the judge's bench. The eyes of the courtroom followed her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. Your Honor, Jenna began, her voice soft but clear, I know the gravity of the crimes Jack has committed. There is no excuse for what he has done. But I ask for mercy, for the chance that Jack might continue his path of rehabilitation. He has shown genuine remorse, and I believe that he has the potential to contribute to society, even from behind bars. The death penalty is irreversible, and I ask that you consider life imprisonment as a means for Jack to continue his journey of redemption." Jenna's words hung in the air. She had always believed in the power of redemption, in the possibility that people could change, that even the darkest pasts could be overcome. But she knew that her plea wasn't just about Jack, it was about what the system stood for. Was justice simply about punishment, or could it also be about healing? On the other side of the courtroom, District Attorney Barbara Reynolds rose from her seat, her expression cold and unwavering. She had spent the entire trial painting Jack as a ruthless killer, and now it was her turn to push for the maximum penalty. "Your Honor," Barbara began, her voice sharp, "the defendant, Jack Raymond, took the lives of innocent people. There is no question that his actions were horrific, senseless, and destructive. While the defense has argued for mercy, we must not forget the victims, the families that were torn apart by Jack's brutality. There is no second chance for the lives he took. The law is clear, first-degree murder deserves the ultimate punishment." Barbara's words were harsh, but they rang true in many minds. It was hard to deny the horror of Jack's past. Kayla Reed sat in the audience, her hands clenched into fists, her jaw set. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Justice for her mother, justice for the lives lost. She had spent so long fighting for this moment, for Jack to pay for the pain he had caused. And now, all she wanted was for the judge to deliver the final blow. Her eyes locked on Jack for a brief moment. She didn't feel satisfaction. She didn't feel any sense of closure. The tears had stopped flowing, but the pain inside her was still as fresh as ever. Jenna returned to her seat, her breath caught in her chest. She didn't look at Jack. She couldn't. His fate was no longer in her hands. It was now in the hands of Judge Price, a decision that would be made with the knowledge that no matter what, someone's life would be forever altered. Judge Price took a long pause, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom before settling on Jack. The entire room held its breath. After considering the facts of this case, Judge Price said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of her decision, "And after hearing from both the defense and the prosecution, the court finds that Jack Raymond will be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words echoed through the courtroom, and for a moment, everything was still. Jack's breath hitched as the reality of the sentence settled in. He would live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his days, but at least he would have the chance to continue to make amends. Jenna felt a rush of relief, but it was fleeting. She had fought for Jack's future, but now the weight of what that future would look like felt heavy. Kayla sat frozen, her eyes wide, her mind numb. This wasn't justice. This wasn't the resolution she had hoped for. And yet, in a strange way, there was something unspeakably final about the sentence. Jack had been given life, but it would never be a life worth living, not after all he had taken. The decision had been made. Now, they all had to face the consequences of that choice. The clanging of the heavy metal door echoed in the cold, sterile prison hallway. Jack Raymond stood in the dimly lit corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been led through the complex maze of cells and guards, each step a stark reminder of the life he was now bound to. A life of confinement, of regret, and of consequences. The walls seemed to close in around him, and for a moment, it felt like he couldn't breathe. He had hoped, prayed even, for a different outcome. Life in prison was not the same as freedom, it wasn't even close. But it was a chance, wasn't it? A chance for him to make amends, to find some shred of redemption. At least, that's what he told himself as they closed the door to his new cell, locking him away from the outside world. Jack sank down onto the cot in his tiny, barren cell. His hands shook as he wiped his face, the weight of the last few weeks catching up to him. He had spent so many sleepless nights wondering if he would ever find peace, if he would ever truly pay for the things he had done. But now, as the reality of his sentence set in, he realized that there was no turning back. There was no undoing the past. For the first time since the trial began, Jack allowed himself to cry. His tears weren't just for himself, but for the lives he had destroyed. The pain he had caused others, the victims, their families, was something he would never be able to escape. And now, as he sat in his prison cell, facing the rest of his life behind bars, the gravity of that pain pressed down on him like a heavy weight. Meanwhile, on the outside, Jenna Mallory struggled to make sense of the decision. She had fought so hard for Jack, believing that he could be redeemed, believing that he could make a meaningful change. But now, with him locked away in prison, Jenna wasn't so sure anymore. The truth was, she had never imagined that this would be the outcome. Life in prison was still a death sentence in its own way. Jack would be trapped in that cage, without the chance to ever make a true contribution to society. But there was a part of Jenna that clung to the belief that even in the darkest of circumstances, there could still be room for change, for redemption. The question was, could Jack really change now? Could he find a way to forgive himself for the horrors of his past, and could others, especially the victims' families, find it in their hearts to forgive him? Jenna sat in her office late one evening, the lights of the city outside her window flickering like stars in the night sky. She was alone, her fingers moving idly over the stack of legal papers in front of her. But her mind was elsewhere, on Jack, on his future, and on the choices she had made. She had believed in him, believed that he was capable of redemption. But now, as she stared at the blank walls of her office, she wondered if she had been too naive. In the weeks following his sentencing, Jack found himself struggling to make sense of his new life. The prison was a cold, unfeeling place, and he quickly learned that survival was more about power and control than it was about remorse. Yet, despite the harsh environment, Jack found a sense of clarity that had eluded him for so long. He had been given a life sentence, but it wasn't just a sentence of time, it was a sentence of purpose. He had spent so many years running from his past, hiding from the consequences of his actions. But now, in the quiet isolation of his prison cell, Jack finally confronted the reality of who he had been and who he needed to become. The days were long, filled with monotonous routines and the unrelenting noise of prison life. Yet, amidst the chaos, Jack began to take small steps toward redemption. He started to attend group therapy sessions, where he faced other inmates, some of whom had committed crimes far worse than his own, and began to listen, really listen, to their stories. Jack realized something during those sessions: redemption wasn't something that could be earned quickly. It wasn't about making grand gestures or changing overnight. It was about accepting the reality of his past, learning to forgive himself, and showing those around him, both inside and outside the prison, that he was capable of change. He began writing letters to the families of his victims, and letters to Jenna, though he had never sent any of them. They were raw, painful expressions of remorse, attempts to make sense of his actions and their consequences. He couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could begin to make amends in small ways, one letter, one conversation, one day at a time. But the pain of his past was never far from him. He would never forget the faces of the victims, the screams, the lives he had destroyed. He would never forget the toll his crimes had taken on others, and on himself. And so, as he lay awake at night, staring at the cold stone walls, he couldn't help but wonder if anyone could ever truly forgive him. In the meantime, Kayla Reed struggled with her own feelings of betrayal and grief. The sentencing had been a bitter pill to swallow. Despite the years of anger, the desire for justice, the death penalty had been off the table. Jack was still alive, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. She had wanted closure. She had wanted justice for her mother, for the life that had been taken so violently. But now, as Jack languished in prison, Kayla didn't feel any better. There was no satisfaction in his imprisonment. There was no relief in seeing him behind bars. In fact, there was only more emptiness. Jack would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes, but in Kayla's mind, it would never be enough. Nothing would ever bring her mother back. As the months passed, Jack's journey in prison became a long and difficult road. His body grew more accustomed to the harsh environment, but his mind never let go of the memories, the guilt, the burden of his past. Redemption was a constant battle, one he didn't know if he would ever win. But Jack held on to the hope that somehow, somewhere, there was a chance for him to prove that people could change, even those who had done the unforgivable. Maybe he would never be fully forgiven. Maybe he would never find peace with the victims' families. But at least, for once, he was trying to make things right. The question that lingered in his mind, and in the minds of those around him, was simple. Could Jack Raymond ever find true redemption, or was he doomed to be defined by his past forever? The prison yard was quieter than usual that morning. It was early, the sun still low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the concrete. Jack Raymond stood by the metal fence, looking out over the landscape as he had done so many times before. But this time, something was different. This time, it felt like the weight of his past, the weight of his mistakes, was finally beginning to lift. Months had passed since his sentencing, and though he still wore the same prison uniform, his life felt somehow different. The man he had been, the cold, hardened criminal, seemed like a distant memory now. He had spent countless hours reflecting, writing, and speaking with others in an attempt to make sense of his past. Every day was a struggle, but each day, he found a little more peace within himself. In the early days of his imprisonment, Jack had often questioned whether he could ever truly change, whether the years of violence and cruelty could ever be erased by the simplest gestures of remorse. But now, as he stared out over the yard, he felt a quiet certainty in his heart. He was still paying for his crimes, he always would, but he had learned something invaluable in the process. He wasn't beyond redemption. It had been months since Jack had written to Kayla Reed. He had sent several letters, long, tearful admissions of guilt, of deep regret, but every one of them had been returned, unopened. He knew that Kayla had no reason to forgive him, no reason to want to hear from the man who had taken her mother's life. But Jack couldn't give up. Not now. Not when he had finally come to terms with his own demons. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack sat at his small desk in his cell, his hands trembling as he wrote another letter. This one was different, though. This one was not just an apology, it was an expression of hope. Kayla, he wrote, I can never undo the harm I caused. I know that nothing I say will bring your mother back or make up for the pain I've caused you and your family. But I need you to know that I am not the man I was. I am sorry. I will always be sorry. But I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours. Jack paused, staring at the words. He had written many letters before, but this one felt different. There was no hope for forgiveness in his mind. There was only a desire to make sure she knew the truth, that he had changed. He folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and handed it to the prison guard. It was out of his hands now. A few weeks later, Jack was sitting in the small visitation room when the door opened, and Kayla Reed stepped inside. She was older now, her face marked by the years of grief, anger, and pain. But there was something different in her eyes. Something softer, though still guarded. She walked to the chair across from Jack and sat down, her gaze fixed on him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with the years of unspoken words, of unhealed wounds. Jack could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for Kayla to say something, anything. He knew she had no obligation to be here, and he didn't expect forgiveness. But he had to face her. He had to. Finally, Kayla spoke, her voice quiet but steady. I read your letter, she said. I wasn't sure if I would, but I did. Jack nodded, his throat tight. I can't bring myself to forgive you, Kayla continued. I don't think I'll ever be able to. But I came here because I need to understand something. Why? Why are you asking for forgiveness now? Why didn't you feel this way before? Why did it take all of this to make you realize what you had done? Jack closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of her questions pressing down on him. He knew she was right to ask. He had spent so much of his life avoiding accountability, ignoring the consequences of his actions. But now, as he faced her, the person who had been most affected by his crimes, he knew he owed her an honest answer. "I didn't understand what I was doing to others," he said quietly. "I was so consumed by my own anger, my own pain, that I didn't care who I hurt. But prison forced me to see the truth. It forced me to face who I really was. And I hated that man. I still do. I've spent every day trying to be different, trying to make up for the things I can't change. I can't undo what I've done. But I want you to know that I've changed. I'm trying. I will keep trying for the rest of my life." Kayla stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And then, finally, Kayla spoke again, her voice softer now. "I can't forgive you, Jack," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I don't know if you need me to forgive you. Maybe it's enough for you to know that you're trying to change. I don't know. I don't know how to feel." Jack nodded, his heart heavy but strangely lighter at the same time. He had come to terms with the fact that forgiveness might never come, at least not from Kayla. But what mattered was that he was changing. What mattered was that he was finally acknowledging the depth of his crimes and facing the consequences with the humility he had lacked for so long. In the months that followed, Jack continued to work on himself. He kept attending therapy sessions, he kept writing, and he kept trying to make a difference in the lives of those around him. His reputation in prison began to shift, as inmates who had once viewed him as a threat began to see him differently. But Jack's real redemption wasn't about changing how others saw him. It wasn't about earning praise or forgiveness. It was about finding peace within himself, about accepting that he couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. As he sat in his prison cell, looking out over the same concrete yard, Jack knew that his journey was far from over. The road to redemption was long and uncertain, and there would always be consequences to his actions. But one thing was clear, he was no longer the man he had been. And that, in itself, was a victory. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?